Before we begin tonight's story, if you're finding value in these accounts, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Now let's begin. My name is Oscar Cook. For 12 years, I served as a park ranger in the Everglades National Park. I grew up in South Florida, spending my life around water and wildlife, believing I knew every danger this place could offer. Alligators, hurricanes, the shifting tides. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. What happened in the 10,000 islands during the summer of 2003 taught me that the Everglades keep secrets deeper than any sinkhole and darker than any mangrove tunnel. It started on June 17th, a Tuesday. I remember the date clearly because it was my daughter's 8th birthday. I had promised to be home early to take her for pizza in Homestead. The temperature was already pushing 95 degrees by mid-morning, the humidity making the air feel heavy, like breathing through a wet towel. It was just another sweltering summer day at the Flamingo Ranger Station, the lonely outpost at the southern tip of the park. Flamingo is as far from civilization as you can get while still having electricity. It's a place where the road ends and the wilderness begins. I was finishing some paperwork when the radio crackled to life. It was Maria Calderon, a ranger station up at Gulf Coast. Her voice had an edge that immediately put me on alert. "Cook, we got a situation," she said. A research team from the University of Miami missed their check-in. They were doing water quality sampling in the 10,000 islands. Last contact was yesterday at 1,600 hours. "How late are they?" I asked, already standing up and grabbing my gear. Marine research teams were usually precise. In the backcountry, discipline is survival. 22 hours, Maria replied. And Oscar, their GPS beacon isn't responding. Last known position was near Lossman's River. My stomach tightened at the name. Lossman's River isn't just a colorful label, it's a warning. It runs through some of the most isolated territory in the park, a maze of mangrove islands and narrow channels where navigation is a nightmare even for the experienced. "I'm en route," I told her. "Get aero support if you can. We might need to cover a lot of water." "Already requested," she said. "But the Coast Guard is delayed by a weather front coming in from the Gulf. You're on your own for now." I loaded my gear into my patrol boat, a 22-foot center console perfect for shallow water. Extra fuel, first aid, water, and emergency radio. The run from Flamingo to Lossman's River is about 20 nautical miles through some of the most beautiful and desolate water in the world. As I pushed the throttle forward, the boat surged into the open water. The 10,000 islands lay ahead, a labyrinth that has swallowed more than one overconfident traveler. I kept to the main channels, watching the tide expose mudflats that could tear the bottom out of a hull. The mangroves on either side formed solid green walls, their roots creating cathedral-like archways over the narrower passages. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the search area. The water here was tea-colored and opaque, hiding everything beneath the surface. I cut the engine and drifted, listening to the silence. The usual sounds of the swamp, the birds, the insects, felt muted here, as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. That was when I knew something was wrong. Drifting in the silence, I scanned the wall of mangroves for anything out of place. The humidity sat on the water, like a fog, blurring the edges of vision. Then I saw it, an aluminum john boat, maybe 14 feet long, tied to a thick mangrove root. It was bobbing gently in the current, looking small and insignificant against the towering vegetation. It was the kind of boat the research team used for shallow work. I pulled alongside, my heart sinking. The boat was a mess. Equipment was scattered everywhere: backpacks, water bottles, a clipboard with waterlogged data sheets. A water quality testing unit was still running off a portable battery, its small light blinking a steady, lonely rhythm. But there were no people. I keyed my radio. Maria, I found one of their boats. No sign of the team. Looks like they left in a hurry. Copy that. Maria's voice came back through the static. What's the condition of the vessel? Intact, I said, climbing into the small boat. Engine is off, but there's no damage. All their gear is still here. GPS unit is still recording. I picked up the GPS. It showed their last recorded waypoints, a methodical path up the river. The last point was time-stamped just 13 minutes before their final radio check-in the previous day. They had been working, and then they had simply stopped. As I searched the boat, I noticed something strange near the bow. Scratched into the aluminum hull were numbers. They weren't written with a marker. They were gouged into the metal, likely with a key or a knife. The scratches were fresh, the bright silver of the aluminum shining through the oxidized surface. 25.3117, 81.0945. Coordinates. Someone had carved GPS coordinates into the boat before they disappeared. I punched them into my handheld unit. They pointed to a location about 2 miles southwest, deeper into the dense maze of islands away from the main channel. Maria, I said, I've got coordinates carved into the boat. Looks fresh. I'm going to check it out. Negative, Cook, she replied instantly. Wait for backup. Coast Guard ETA is still 90 minutes out. If they are in trouble, you go in alone adds to the risk. I'm not waiting 90 minutes, I said, looking at the dark water. These people could be injured. I'll keep my radio on. If I don't check in every 15 minutes, send everyone. There was a pause, then a resigned sigh. Copy that. Be careful out there, Oscar. I transferred some emergency supplies to my patrol boat and turned toward the coordinates. The channel grew narrower as I went, the mangroves closing in until I was navigating passages barely wider than my boat. The tide was dropping, and I could hear the soft grinding of mud under my hull. If I went much further, I'd be stuck until the tide returned. The coordinates led me to a spot where 3 small channels converged, forming a hidden open area maybe 50 feet across. And there, in the center of this isolated space, was something I had never seen in 12 years of patrolling. A wooden structure. It looked ancient, built from silver-gray mangrove wood, with posts driven into muddy bottom, supporting a platform above the water. It leaned at a precarious angle, slowly collapsing. I approached slowly, scanning for the missing team. That's when I saw them. 2 figures sitting on the platform. My heart jumped. Dr. Kravitz. Tom. I shouted, gunning the engine to close the distance. But as I got closer, I slowed down. They weren't waving. They weren't moving. They were sitting perfectly still, backs against the rotting wood, staring at each other in the blazing heat. They looked like statues, indifferent to the sun burning their skin or the sound of my approach. The atmosphere in that small clearing was heavy, charged with a silence that felt unnatural. I tied off my boat and climbed onto the rotting platform, the wood spongy under my boots. I reached out to touch the woman's shoulder, dread pooling in my stomach. They were alive, but they weren't really there. The platform felt unstable beneath my boots, the wood giving way slightly with every shift of my weight. It was a sensation of standing on something that had long ago surrendered to the elements, a structure that belonged more to the water than to the land. I knelt beside Dr. Haley Kravitz. She was a marine biologist I had met briefly during previous permit applications, a woman of sharp intellect and boundless energy for conservation. Now, she sat motionless, her posture rigid, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a point in space that I could not see. Opposite her sat Tom Hopkins, her graduate student. He was young, usually full of that nervous enthusiasm that defines those just starting their careers. Today, he was a mirror image of his mentor, silent and still, his hands resting limply on his knees. The heat on the platform was intense, radiating from the sun-bleached wood and reflecting off the dark water. They had been out here for hours, exposed to the full force of the Florida summer, without shelter. Their skin was red, the evidence of severe sunburn clear even to the layer of salt and sweat. Yet they did not flinch. They did not react to the flies buzzing around them or the glare of the sun. It was as if their minds had detached from their bodies, leaving behind empty vessels to weather the storm. "Haley," I said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. The contact felt intrusive in the heavy silence. "Tom, can you hear me?" There was no response, not a flicker of recognition. Their chests rose and fell in a shallow, steady rhythm, proving they were alive, but their spirits seemed absent. I checked Haley's pulse. It was rapid, a sign of dehydration and heat stress. I reached for my radio, my hand trembling slightly. The isolation of this place was beginning to press in on me. "Maria," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I found 2 members of the research team. They are alive but unresponsive. It looks like severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. I need medical evacuation immediately." Maria's voice came back, laced with relief but also concern. "Coast Guard is en route to your position. ETA 20 minutes. What is their condition?" "Unconscious but breathing," I replied, looking at their vacant expressions. "But Maria, there is something else. They are just sitting here. It is like they're in a trance. They haven't moved since I arrived. Get them hydrated and into the shade if you can," she instructed. "Help is coming." I moved to help Haley first, intending to transfer her into my boat, where the canopy would offer some protection. As I gently took hold of her arms to lift her, her head lolled forward, and then, without warning, she began to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, a dry, raspy sound that seemed to scrape against the silence. "Don't go down," she murmured. "Don't go down to where it waits." I froze. The words were clear, despite the weakness in her voice. "Haley," I asked. "Haley, look at me. Can you tell me what happened?" She did not look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the middle distance as she repeated the phrase, a broken loop of thought. "The water remembers. The water always remembers. Don't go down." Tom began to speak then, too. His voice was a monotone echo of hers, devoid of inflection. "We saw it. We saw it below. It has been there so long in the dark. It wants to come up." A profound unease settled over me. This was not the delirium of heat stroke I had seen before. This was something different, a shared experience that had locked them into a singular, terrifying perspective. I worked quickly, moving both of them into my boat. They were pliable, moving like marionettes, offering no resistance but no assistance either. I covered them with a tarp to shield them from the sun and carefully poured small amounts of water into their mouths. They swallowed reflexively, but gave no sign of awareness. While I waited for the Coast Guard, I returned to the platform to search for clues. The structure fascinated and repelled me. It was built from mangrove wood that had turned silver gray with age, the posts driven deep into the mud. As I looked closer, I saw markings carved into the weathered timber. They were symbols, faint and worn by decades of wind and rain, spirals and geometric shapes that reminded me of the collusive petroglyphs found in museums, the work of the indigenous people who had lived in these waters thousands of years before us. But there was something newer as well. Scratched into one of the support posts, just above the waterline, were more coordinates. And below the numbers, 3 words were carved in rough, jagged letters. "Third time charm." The sound of rotors thumping in the distance broke my concentration. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived 23 minutes later, hovering low over the mangroves, the wash from its blades churning the dark water into whitecaps. They lowered a rescue basket, and together we loaded Haley and Tom. Even as they were hoisted into the air, swaying gently against the blue sky, I could see their lips moving, whispering their warnings to the wind. "You coming with us?" The medic shouted down over the roar of the engine. I shook my head, pointing to the east. "No, I have to find the rest of the team. There were 4 people out here." The medic nodded, gave a thumbs up, and the helicopter lifted away, banking toward the mainland. As the noise faded, silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavier than before. I was alone again in the maze, with nothing but the cryptic carvings and the coordinates to guide me. I looked at the new numbers I had found. I punched them into my GPS. They pointed even deeper into the 10,000 islands, into an area marked on my charts as open water, though I knew from experience that the charts were often optimistic in this constantly shifting landscape. The tide had turned and was beginning to flow back in, raising the water level and giving me a window of opportunity. I could have waited for Maria to send another boat. That would have been the prudent choice. But the image of Haley and Tom, hollowed out by whatever they had witnessed, drove me forward. If the other two researchers were in similar condition, every minute mattered. I pushed the throttle forward, guiding the boat away from the platform and into the narrowing channels once more. The mangroves here were old growth, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots forming complex, impassable tangles. It felt as though the forest was watching, waiting to see if I would heed the warning or follow the path of those who had gone before. I chose the path. The navigation to the second set of coordinates was a test of patience and skill. The waterways here were ancient, untouched by the dredging and marking that tamed the outer channels. I had to rely entirely on the GPS, trusting the digital line on the screen as the physical world became increasingly disorienting. The mangroves grew so tall and dense that they blocked out the horizon, creating a tunnel of green shadows where the light filtered through in shifting, deceptive patterns. After 30 minutes of slow, careful maneuvering, I reached the point where the coordinates indicated I should be. There was nothing there. I circled the area, frustration mounting. The GPS insisted I had arrived, yet all I could see was an impenetrable wall of vegetation. No open water, no platform, no boat. I slowed the engine to an idle, letting the boat drift as I scanned the shoreline for any anomaly. The heat was stifling here, the air still and thick with the scent of decaying leaves and salt. Then I noticed it, a break in the mangroves, so narrow and overgrown that it was invisible from a direct angle. It was a natural fissure, a channel barely wider than my boat, cutting through the island at a sharp angle. I steered toward it, the branches scraping against the hull and the T-top of the center console. I had to use a machete to clear a fallen limb that blocked the entrance, the wood dense and resistant. As I pushed through, the canopy closed overhead completely, plunging me into a twilight gloom. The channel wound its way inward for perhaps 50 yards before opening up abruptly into a hidden world. It was a small enclosed bay, perhaps 100 feet across, completely circled by high mangroves. It was a secret pocket of water, hidden from the sky and the sea. In the center of this space sat a boat. It was a research team's main vessel, a 26-foot Carolina skiff, fully equipped with their sampling gear and supplies. It was anchored securely in the middle of the bay, rocking gently in the barely perceptible current. As I drew closer, the silence of the place struck me. In the rest of the 10,000 islands, the water is always in motion, stirred by wind and tide. But here, the water was perfectly still. It was glass smooth and unervingly dark, not the tea-colored tannins, but a deep, inky black that seemed to absorb the light. I could see a figure sitting in the stern of the skiff. "Dr. Morton?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "It's Oscar Cook, park ranger. Are you all right?" There was no answer. I pulled my boat alongside the skiff and tied off. Dr. James Morton, the team leader and a respected marine ecologist with 20 years of experience in the glades, was sitting upright on a cooler. He was in the same state as Haley and Tom, eyes open but unfocused, skin burned by the sun, body rigid. Near the bow, slumped against the gunwale, was the fourth team member, Rachel Kim. Her condition appeared even worse. She was barely holding herself upright, her head resting on her chest. I boarded their boat and immediately began checking vitals. Both had weak, thready pulses. I radioed for another evacuation, my voice tight with urgency. But as I worked to set up 4 fluids for Rachel, I became aware of a presence in the bay. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a feeling, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the water itself. The stillness of the black water felt heavy, as if it were holding immense pressure just beneath the surface. Dr. Morton shifted. His head turned slowly toward me, the movement jerky and mechanical. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "We went down," he said. The words were clear, deliberate. "We shouldn't have gone down." I paused, looking at him. "Dr. Morton, stay calm. Help is on the way." He ignored me, his eyes staring past my shoulder into the dark water. It showed us things that have been waiting in the dark since before the sea came. It wants to be remembered. It needs to be remembered or it fades. "What did you see?" I asked, trying to keep him talking, to keep him anchored to reality. "What is down there?" "Every 10 years it calls," he recited, his tone devoid of emotion. "Every 10 years someone goes down to remember. 1983, 1993, 2003. The third time is a charm. The third time it rises." Rachel stirred then, lifting her head. Her eyes were filled with tears that did not fall. "The water is a door," she whispered, "and the door is open." The Coast Guard arrived with a rescue boat this time, the helicopter unable to find a safe clearing to lower a basket near this hidden bay. We transferred Dr. Morton and Rachel, both of them muttering their incomprehensible warnings. The medic looked at me, shaking his head. "Heat stroke and dehydration," he said, mirroring the diagnosis of the first team. "But I have never seen anything like this. It is like a mass hallucination." As the rescue boat motored away, leaving a wake that quickly smoothed out into stillness, I stood alone on the deck of my patrol boat. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the bay. The water looked like a sheet of obsidian. I should have followed them. I should have started my engine and left this place immediately. That would have been the rational choice. But the words of the researchers echoed in my mind. We went down. I looked around the research vessel. Neatly stowed along the gunnels was diving equipment, full scuba gear, tanks, regulators, masks. It was well maintained and ready for use. They had been conducting underwater surveys. Whatever they had seen, whatever had placed them in that trance, they had found it beneath the surface. The depth finder on my boat read 15 feet. It wasn't deep, but looking into that black water, it felt bottomless. I made a decision then that defies the logic of my training. I told myself it was an investigation, that I needed to secure evidence to understand the accident. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I felt a pull, a subtle gravity emanating from the center of the bay. I needed to know. I checked the air in one of the tanks, tested the regulator, and pulled on the fins. The water was warmer than I expected as I slipped over the side, enveloping me instantly. I turned on my dive light and began to descend, a lone beam of light cutting to the murk, down toward the bottom of the hidden bay where the secrets of the Everglades lay waiting. The transition from the humid air of the bay to the embrace of the water was immediate and total. As I descended, the world above, the mangroves, the sunset, the questions, vanished, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of my regulator and the stream of silver bubbles racing toward the surface. The water in this enclosed bay was warmer than I had anticipated, wrapping around me with a temperature that felt almost biological, like the interior of a living thing. My dive light cut a narrow cone through the darkness, illuminating particles of sediment that danced like dust motes in a sunbeam. The visibility was poor, the water thick with dissolved organic matter. But as I went deeper, the tea-colored haze began to clear, revealing the bottom. It was not the soft mud or sand typical of the Everglades. Here, the floor was solid rock, limestone bedrock, stripped clean of silt. It glowed faintly under the beam of my light, a pale, lunar landscape hidden beneath the dark water. In the center of the depression, I found the source of the current I had felt earlier. It was a fissure in the rock, a jagged opening perhaps 3 feet wide, leading down into the earth. Cool, fresh water was pulsing out of it, mixing with the warm, brackish water of the bay in a shimmering haze of refraction. This was a spring, a direct vein connecting the surface to the vast, submerged aquifers that flow beneath the entire Florida peninsula. I hovered at the edge of the opening, shining my light into the abyss. The limestone walls were smooth, worn down by millennia of water flow. I should have turned back. Every instinct trained into me over a decade of service screamed that this was unsafe, that entering a confined underwater space alone was a violation of every safety protocol. But the pull was stronger now, a magnetic resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I pulled myself through the opening, the tank on my back scraping gently against the rock. The fissure opened into a submerged chamber, a natural cathedral carved by water and time. It was spacious, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that arched overhead like a dome. As I turned, my light swept across the walls, and I gasped, nearly losing the seal on my mouthpiece. The walls were covered in art. They were not the random scratches of nature, but deliberate, intricate carvings. Spirals, geometric patterns, and stylized figures covered every inch of the limestone surface. They shifted and seemed to move as the shadows played across them, a silent gallery of a time long forgotten. In the center of the chamber, resting on the smooth stone floor, was a structure. It was cylindrical, roughly 4 feet tall, constructed from materials that belonged to the sea, mangrove wood that had been preserved by the lack of oxygen, pieces of coral, and bound together with a vine that had petrified into stone. It looked incredibly old, yet carefully maintained. As I finned closer, floating weightlessly around it, the details became clear. Integrated into the structure were the remnants of those who had come before. There were bones polished and placed with reverence, forming part of the architecture. They were not discarded, but honored, built into the framework as if to serve as eternal guardians. Inside the open framework of the cylinder, visible through the gaps in the ancient wood, was something else. It was a pale, withered shape. It was organic, preserved by the cool, mineral-rich water of the spring. It huddled there, motionless, looking like a relic from an era before humanity walked the earth. It was difficult to comprehend its form. The proportions seemed foreign, a biology that did not fit into the taxonomy I knew. Then I heard it. It was not a sound that traveled through the ears, but a vibration that resonated directly in the mind. It was a low, humming frequency that emanated from the structure, from the pale form within. And with that vibration came the images. They did not come as thoughts, but as fully formed memories, flashing through my consciousness faster than I could process them. I saw the Everglades not as they are now, but as they were 12,000 years ago. I saw a dry, savanna-like landscape where the sea was miles away. I saw the first people arriving, following the great game herds, finding the spring and the entity that slept within the stone. I saw them realizing that this place was sacred, a threshold between worlds. I saw the Calusa, the powerful civilization that ruled these waters for centuries, coming here in great canoes. I saw their elders performing ceremonies, placing offerings, singing songs that resonated with the frequency of the stone. The vision shifted. I saw Spanish missionaries arriving in their heavy robes, confused and fearful what they found, retreating in awe before a power they could not name. I saw the Seminole people, seeking refuge in the swamps during the wars that tried to remove them, finding solace and guidance in the deep places. And through it all, I understood the purpose. The entity fed on memory. It existed in a state of suspension, kept asleep by the act of being known. The ceremonies, the visits, the offerings, they were not worship in traditional sense, but a maintenance ritual. By remembering it, by acknowledging its existence, the people kept it bound to the specific location, kept it from waking fully and seeking sustenance elsewhere. The realization hit me with physical force. The research team, they had found this place. They had come down, seen the entity, and in doing so, they had accidentally fulfilled the ritual. They had remembered it, but they did not understand what they were doing. They carried the memory back to the surface without the context, without the intent to bind. And now, the structure was failing. I looked closely at the cylinder. The petrified vines were cracking. The wood was splintering. The pale form inside was shifting, unfolding slowly like a flower blooming in the dark. The presence of my mind grew stronger, reaching out with tendrils of need. It wanted to be known. It wanted to be remembered perfectly. It showed me what would happen if it was forgotten, a fading, a dissolution, followed by a terrible, chaotic rising to reclaim its place in the world. It did not want to destroy. It simply wanted to exist. And to exist, it needed a witness. I felt my own memories being examined, sifted through by an alien intelligence. It was not painful, but it was profoundly altering. I was no longer just Oscar Cook. I was becoming part of the lineage, another link in the chain of memory that stretched back to the Ice Age. Panic began to rise, a cold counterpoint to the warm water. I was not ready. I did not know the songs or the rituals. I kicked hard, breaking the connection, and shot back toward the fissure. The current from the spring seemed to push me, aiding my escape. I squeezed through the opening, scraping my equipment against a rock, and ascended into the tea-colored water of the bay. I broke the surface, gasping, ripping the mask from my face, gulping down the humid, sweet air of the evening. The sky was purple and orange, the sun having set while I was below. I hauled myself into the boat, shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of what I had seen. The silence of the bay was no longer empty. It was full of watching eyes. I navigated the boat back to Marina in a daze, towing the empty research vessel behind me. The journey through the darkened mangroves felt different now. The twisted roots and overhanging branches were no longer just obstacles. They were part of the same living system I had touched in the spring, a vast, interconnected organism that held memories in its soil and water. The moon had risen by the time I saw the lights of Flamingo. They looked harsh and artificial, piercing the natural darkness with an aggressive brightness. Maria was waiting at the dock with 2 other rangers and a representative from the university. They helped me secure the boats, their movements efficient and professional. Maria looked at me closely, her eyes scanning my face for answers. She did not ask immediately. The look on my face must have told her that whatever had happened out, there was not something that could be explained in a quick debriefing on the dock. We walked to the station in silence, the gravel crunching loudly under our boots. "I need to make some calls," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, distant and hollow. "And I need access to the park archives. Specifically, historical records going back as far as we have them." "Oscar, what happened?" Maria asked softly once we were inside the office. "The Coast Guard said you looked like you had seen a ghost when you surfaced." I sat heavily in the office chair, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. "The research team," I said, choosing my words carefully. "They didn't just suffer from heat stroke. They found something in the water, and I think it's been there a very long time." I spent the next hour on the phone with Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. The doctors were baffled. Physically, the researchers were stabilizing. The dehydration was being managed. The burns were being treated. But mentally, they remained in that strange, detached state, cycling through the same phrases, their minds locked in a loop of memory. The doctors were discussing transferring them to a psychiatric facility. I insisted on coming to see them. I needed to know exactly what they had seen, to confirm if their vision matched my own. The drive to Miami was a surreal experience. I drove the 80 miles in the silence of the Everglades to the neon sprawl of the city, feeling the transition between 2 very different realities. The city felt fragile to me now, a thin veneer of concrete and light layered over a land that remembered things much older than skyscrapers. At the hospital, I found the team in a secure wing. Dr. Haley Kravitz was awake, sitting up in bed. She was staring at a television that was turned off, seeing something on the black screen that wasn't there. When I entered, she turned to me. Her eyes were clear, but they held a depth that was unsettling. "You went down," she said. "It wasn't a question. I can see it in you. You saw what we saw. Haley, I said, pulling a chair close to the bed, I need you to tell me everything. What did you find in that spring? What was in the structure? She took a breath, and for a moment, the scientist returned, trying to categorize the impossible. The old one, the ancient thing. It has been sleeping in the limestone since before the ice retreated. The first people found it and learned to keep it sleeping. They fed it memories so it wouldn't need to feed on anything else. Every 10 years, someone has to remember, has to see it and know it and carry that knowledge back to surface. Why every 10 years? I asked. Because memory fades, she whispered. People forget. Stories become legends. Legends become myths. And when the memory thins, it begins to wake. It begins to hunger for recognition. So someone goes down. A witness. They keep the memory alive, and it sleeps again. Her voice trembled. But something has changed. The binding is weak. We didn't know the ritual. We just saw it. We woke it up, but we didn't put it back to sleep. I saw the carvings. I said, I saw the dates. 1983, 1993, 2003. Haley nodded slowly. 3 cycles. After 3 cycles of imperfect binding, the structure fails. The 3rd time is a charm. It is almost free. Before I could ask more, a nurse arrived to tell me visiting hours were over. As I left the room, Haley called out one last thing. Check the records. Oscar. Check 1983. They thought it was an accident. I spent the entirety of the next day at the South Florida Research Center in Homestead. Maria joined me, and together we pulled every file, every incident report, every logbook related to the 10,000 islands. We spread them out on a large conference table, turning the chaos of paper into a timeline. Once we knew what to look for, the pattern was undeniable. Every 10 years, almost to the month, there was an incident in that specific sector of the park. Sometimes it was a drowning, explained away as a tragic accident. Sometimes it was a vessel found drifting with the crew missing. Sometimes it was people found wandering the mangroves in a state of confusion, unable to speak of what they had seen. We traced it back. 1993. A solo kayaker found incoherent, speaking of eyes in the deep. 1983. A marine biology team from Florida State University went missing for 2 days. When they were found, they were in a state identical to Haley's team. Dehydrated, sunburned, but physically intact. The official report cited heat exhaustion and disorientation. But deep in the file, we found the handwritten notes of the ranger who had found them. His name was Robert Hayes. Hayes had noted that the survivors refused to leave the water, that they kept begging to go back down to finish the song. He had written about strange markings on their boat, coordinates scratched into the hull. The report had been filed away, the anomalies dismissed as the ravings of traumatized victims. Robert Hayes, I said, tapping the faded paper. He retired 5 years ago. He lives in Naples now. Do you think he knows? Maria asked, looking at the stack of files that represented decades of hidden history. I think he saw something he couldn't explain, I replied. And I think he has been waiting for someone to ask him about it. I called Hayes that afternoon. When I explained who I was and what I'd found in the bay, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. It was the silence of a man who had been holding a heavy weight for a very long time. I was hoping I would never have to speak of that day again. Hayes said, his voice raspy with age. But I suppose some things do not stay buried forever. The water always gives back what it takes. He agreed to meet me. As I hung up the phone, I looked at the map on the wall. The 10,000 islands looked like a fractured puzzle, a scattering of land dissolving into the sea. Somewhere out there, in the hidden bay, the entity was waiting. The cycle was broken. The binding was failing, and the responsibility of the memory was now drifting toward me, inevitable as a tide. The drive to Everglades City is a journey backward in time. As I left the main highways and navigated the narrow roads leading west, the modern world seemed to peel away layer by layer. This small town, perched on the ragged edge of the 10,000 islands, carries the weight of its history in the weathered facades of its buildings and the silent, watchful gaze of its residents. It is a place built on the bounty of the water, a community that understands the shifting moods of the tides better than the ticking of a clock. The air here hangs heavy with the scent of brackish water and drying nets, a perfume of salt and earth that settles into your clothes and stays with you. I arranged to meet Robert Hayes at an old fishing dock near the center of town. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the Gulf, casting long, golden shadows across the water. When I arrived, I found him sitting on a weathered wooden bench, staring out the channel where fishing boats were returning for the day. Hayes was a man in his late 60s, his face a map of deep lines carved by decades of exposure to the Florida sun. He sat with a stillness that reminded me of the herons that stand guard in the shallows, watchful, patient, and deeply connected to his surroundings. I introduced myself, and he nodded, offering a hand that felt like dry leather. We exchanged the usual pleasantries about the weather and the fishing conditions, the polite dance of two men who know the language of the outdoors. But beneath the surface conversation, there was a tension, a mutual understanding of why we were there. I could see it in his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something that did not fit into the neatly ordered world of park regulations and scientific reports. I asked him about 1983. I asked him about the researchers from Florida State University and the day he found them. Hayes looked away, his gaze drifting back to the water. He took a long time to answer, as if he were pulling the memories up from a deep, submerged place. He told me that he remembered every detail of that day. He remembered the heat, the unnatural silence of mangroves, and the discovery of the platform. He described it exactly as I had seen it, the ancient wooden pilings, the strange geometry of the construction, the feeling that it was a place out of time. He told me about the three researchers. They had been sitting there like statues, he said, facing each other in a triangle, oblivious to the world around them. When he and his partner had pulled them from the platform, the researchers were not grateful or relieved. They were distant. They spoke in riddles, muttering about a thing in the water, about the need to witness, to remember. Hayes told me that the official report was sanitized. His supervisor at the time, a man focused on public relations and funding, had dismissed the strange details as the delirium of heat stroke. The mention of coordinates carved into the boat, the descriptions of the underwater structure, all of it was edited out, relegated to the realm of folklore and exhaustion. I asked him if he had ever gone back, if he had ever tried to find the place again. Hayes turned to look at me, and I saw a flicker of old fear in his expression. He admitted that he had tried, about a year after the incident, driven by a nagging sense of unfinished business. He had taken a boat out alone. He had the coordinates. He knew the waterways better than anyone, but when he arrived at the location, it was gone. The mangroves had shifted. Channels that should have been there were closed off by thick walls of roots. Open bays had become mudflats. It was as if the landscape itself had rearranged to hide the location, or perhaps to protect him from finding it again. He told me what became of the researchers. They recovered physically, their burns healed, their strength returned. But they were never the same. They left marine biology. They left Florida. One moved to the mountains of Colorado, as far from the ocean as one could get. Another went into technology in a city of concrete and glass. They ran, he said. They ran from the water because they knew what was waiting in it. They carried the memory, but they treated it as a curse, something to be buried and forgotten. And that, Hayes explained, was the problem. He looked at me with a sudden intensity. He said that he felt the cycle turning again. He felt the tension in the air, the way the birds went quiet at certain times of the day. He knew that 10 years had passed since the last incident, and 10 years before that. The rhythm was undeniable. He told me that by burying the truth in 1983, by dismissing it as an accident, they had failed to address the root of the phenomenon. They had left the door ajar. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Hayes gave me a piece of advice. He told me that there were older stories about this place, stories that predated the Park Service and the pioneers. He mentioned the indigenous people who had lived here for thousands of years, who had understood the spiritual geography of the Everglades in a way we never could. He told me to seek out a man named Jimmy Oyola. He was an elder who lived on a reservation to the north, a keeper of the old ways. Hayes said that if anyone could explain what lived in the Blackwater, it would be him. I left Hayes on the dock as the twilight settled over Everglades City. He looked small against the vast backdrop of the darkening sky, a lone witness to a mystery that was slowly waking up. I got into my truck and turned north, leaving the coast behind. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by my headlights, cutting a path through the wilderness toward the next piece of the puzzle. I felt the weight of Hayes's words traveling with me, the realization that this was not just a series of accidents, but a recurring chapter in a story that had been telling itself for generations, and I was now writing the next few lines. The journey to the Miccosukee Reservation took me along the Tamimi Trail, a narrow ribbon of asphalt that slices through the heart of the Everglades. At night, this road feels like a bridge across a dark ocean. On either side, the sawgrass stretches out into infinity, a vast, breathing expanse that whispers in the wind. The headlights of my truck caught only fleeting glimpses of the life that thrives in the darkness. The reflective eyes of an alligator in a canal, the ghostly flight of an owl, the mist rising from the warm water to meet the cooling air. It is a drive that demands respect, a reminder that human presence here is temporary and fragile. I arrived at the reservation under the cover of a moonless night. The community here exists in a unique balance, maintaining ancient traditions while navigating the currents of the modern world. I found Jimmy Oyola's home set back from the road, a modest structure surrounded by trees that seemed to embrace the house in protective shadows. The air here smelled with smoke and damp earth, a comforting, grounding scent. Jimmy Oyola was a man in his 70s, though his movements possessed the fluidity of someone much younger. He welcomed me with quiet dignity, his expression serious but kind. When I explained who I was and why I had come, referencing Robert Hayes and the events in the 10,000 Islands, his demeanor shifted. The polite reserve of a host transformed into the grave focus of a teacher. He invited me inside, saying that this was not a conversation to be had where the wind could carry the words away. The interior of his home was a testament to a life lived between two worlds. Family photographs in modern frames sat beside traditional cypress carvings and sweetgrass baskets. He offered me a seat and a cup of bitter, dark tea. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the glades outside. Then he began to speak. He told me a story that was not a myth, but a history passed down through oral tradition, preserved with the precision of a sacred text. He spoke of a time long before the Seminole or the Miccosukee came to Florida, before even the Calusa built their great shell mounds. He spoke of an entity that existed in the liminal space between the water and the stone. It was not a spirit in the way we often think of ghosts, nor was it a monster. It was, he explained, a consciousness of the land itself, a being of memory and time that had become trapped in the geology of the peninsula. The first people who came to this land found it. They realized that it could not be destroyed, for it was part of the fabric of the place. But it could not be allowed to roam free, for its presence distorted reality, bending the laws of nature and bringing storms and chaos. So they learned to bind it. But this binding was not a cage of iron or stone. It was a binding of the mind. Oyola explained that the entity fed on recognition. It desired to be known, to exist in the thoughts of living things. If it was ignored, if it was forgotten, it grew restless. It would reach out, influencing the waters, creating disturbances to force humanity to acknowledge it, to keep it dormant, to keep the balance. The people established a cycle. Every generation, or every few years depending on the alignment of the stars and seasons, someone would go to the sacred spring. They would go down into the water to witness the entity. This act, the act of seeing, of remembering, was the offering. By carrying the memory of the entity within them, The chosen person became a vessel. The entity would be satisfied that it was real in the minds of men, and it would return to its slumber. It was a symbiotic relationship. The humans provided memory. The entity provided stability to the waters. But then came the great changes. The arrival of the Europeans, the wars, the displacement of the indigenous tribes, and the encroachment of the modern world. The old ceremonies were disrupted. The knowledge of the specific rituals, the songs that guided the safe passage, was fragmented. The cycle was broken. For the last few decades, Oyola said, the entity has been waking up. The incidents I had uncovered, the drownings, the disappearances, the confused researchers, these were the entity's attempts to force a connection. It was calling out, pulling people down to the spring in a desperate bid to be remembered. But these modern encounters were flawed. The researchers from 1983 and the team from this week, they went down without understanding. They saw, but they did not know. They were accidental witnesses, not willing keepers. Their terror, their confusion, tainted the memory. It was not a pure binding. It was a fractured one. And now, he told me, the situation was critical. The structure in the underwater chamber, the physical focal point of the binding, was crumbling because the spiritual support was gone. The third-time charm carved into the wood was not a taunt, but a countdown. After 3 cycles of failed binding, the connection would snap. The entity would no longer be content with a single witness. It would seek to make itself known to the entire world, likely through a catastrophic event that would reshape the geography of the coast. I asked him what could be done. I asked if the binding could be restored. Oyola looked at me with eyes that held a profound sadness. He told me that the physical structure was merely a marker. The true binding happened in the heart and the mind. To seal the connection properly, to put the entity back to sleep for another generation, someone had to go down one final time. But this time, it could not be an accident. It could not be a frightened victim. It had to be someone who understood the history, someone who went willingly, someone who was prepared to accept the burden. He warned me about the cost. The entity does not just take memory, it gives it. To bind it, one must open their mind to it. The person who performs a ritual will carry the memories of the earth, the weight of thousands of years of history. It is a heaviness that changes a person forever, a solitude that cannot be shared. He told me that once you become a keeper of the memory, you can never truly leave the water. You become part of the story, another layer in the sediment of the Everglades. I left the reservation with my mind reeling. The drive back toward the coast felt different. The darkness was no longer empty. It was filled with the silent narration of a land. I understood now why I had felt that pull in the bay. I understood why the other researchers had been broken by what they saw. They had been forced open by a power too vast for them to comprehend. I realized that my investigation was no longer about solving a missing person's case. It was about stepping into a role that had been vacant for too long. The road ahead was leading me back to the 10,000 islands, back to the hidden bay, where the black water waited for a witness who finally knew the truth. I returned to Homestead as the first light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, turning the gray horizon into a soft lavender. The world felt different now, reshaped by the knowledge I had received in the quiet darkness of the reservation. The rational part of my mind, trained in the strict protocols of law enforcement and the empirical evidence of science, wanted to reject what Jimmy Oyola had told me. It wanted to dismiss the stories of ancient entities and binding rituals as folklore, the superstitions of a bygone era. But beneath that skepticism lay a deeper certainty, a resonance that vibrated in my bones. I had seen the structure. I had felt the presence in the water. I had touched the impossible, and it had touched me back. I spent the next day in a state of restless anticipation, going through the motions of my duties, but with my mind constantly drifting back to the hidden bay. I checked the weather reports, the tidal charts, anything that might give me a sense of control over what was coming. But the feeling of inevitability only grew stronger, like the pressure dropping before a hurricane. It was late afternoon when the radio at the station crackled to life, shattering the uneasy silence. "Cook, this is dispatch. We have a situation." My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was coming before the words were spoken. 2 kayakers reported missing in the 10,000 islands. The dispatcher continued, her voice professional but tense. "A couple from Minnesota. Last seen this morning near Lossman's River. They filed a float plan, but failed to return to Marina by sunset." My blood ran cold. It was happening again. The cycle was accelerating. The entity was not satisfied with the accidental encounter with the research team. It was still hungry for a true witness, for a completion of the ritual. It was reaching out, pulling innocent people into its orbit. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, intercepting Maria in the hallway. She took one look at my face and stopped. "Oscar, you look exhausted. When was the last time you slept?" "I'll sleep when this is over," I said, my voice tight. "Get a boat ready. We're going back to the bay." "The missing kayakers?" she asked, falling into step beside me. "We have search teams mobilizing for the main channels." "Why go back to that specific spot?" "Because I know where they are," I replied. "Or at least, I know where they're being drawn to. The entity is calling them. We need to get there before they have been out there too long." Maria stopped, grabbing my arm to halt me. "Oscar, listen to yourself. Entity? Calling them? You sound like..." She trailed off, searching for a kind word. "Like I've lost my mind?" I finished for her. "I know how it sounds, Maria, but you saw the files. You saw the pattern. 1983, 1993, every 10 years. I'm telling you, there's something down there, something ancient, and it is breaking free. I can feel it. Every hour that passes, it gets stronger. We have to go." She looked at me for a long moment, searching my eyes for any sign of instability. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I have known you for a long time. Oscar, you are the most grounded ranger I know. If you say we need to go, we go." We assembled a small team, myself, Maria, and 2 other seasoned rangers. We loaded the boat with spotlights, emergency medical equipment, and extra lines. The sun had set by the time we launched, plunging the Everglades into a profound velvet darkness. Navigating the mangroves at night is a treacherous undertaking under the best of conditions. The narrow channels twist and turn, the roots reaching out like snares to catch the unwary. Even with our GPS and powerful spotlights cutting through the gloom, the journey was slow and tense. Every shadow looked threatening. Every splash in the water sounded amplified in the silence. It took us 3 hours to reach the hidden bay. As we cut the engines and drifted through the narrow, overgrown entrance, the oppressive atmosphere of the place washed over us instantly. The air here was still and thick, devoid of the usual night sounds. Our spotlight swept across the black water, the beams revealing nothing but the smooth, oily surface. Then the light caught them. On the ancient wooden platform in the center of the bay, the same place where I had found Haley and Tom, sat 2 figures. They were sitting back to back against the rotting support posts, their legs drawn up, their heads bowed. We pulled alongside quietly, the boat bumping gently against the pilings. I climbed up first. The kayakers were a young couple, sunburned and exhausted but alive. They were in the same trance-like state as the others, their eyes open but seeing nothing of the world around them. Their lips moved in a synchronized rhythm, whispering words that were barely audible over the lap of the water. "Maria, get them in the boat," I ordered softly. "Gentle. Don't startle them." As we moved them, their bodies felt unnaturally light, as if their substance had been drained away. The man murmured as we lifted him, his voice a dry rasp. "It's waking. It's waking. It wants to be whole." Maria looked at me, fear flickering in her eyes. "Oscar, we need to get these people to a hospital. We need to leave." "You take them," I said, turning back toward the water. I began to strip off my shirt, reaching for the dive gear we had brought. "What?" "No, Oscar. Maria protested. You can't go down there again. It's suicide. I have to, I said, checking the air pressure in the tank. If we leave now, it will just call someone else. It won't stop until the cycle is finished. Jimmy Oyola told me what needs to be done. Someone has to go down willingly. Someone has to witness it and accept the memory. If I don't do this, it's going to get worse. The binding will break completely. Maria looked from the comatose kayakers to the black water and then back to me. She saw the resolve in my face. How do you bind something like that? She whispered. I don't know exactly, I admitted, strapping on the weight belt, but I have to try. I have to let it know that it is remembered. I have to seal the door. I sat on the gun of the boat, the heavy tank on my back, the fins on my feet. I looked at Maria one last time. If I don't come up in 30 minutes, I said, take the team and go. Don't come in after me. Before she could argue, I rolled backward off the boat and plunged into the warm, dark embrace of the bay. The silence of the underwater world was instant and absolute. The chaotic noises of the surface, the wind, the boat engine, the worried voices, were cut off, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of my own breathing. I switched on my primary dive light, its beam cutting a sharp, white path through the tea-colored gloom. The water felt heavier this time, thicker, as if the very medium I was swimming through was resisting my presence. Or perhaps it was my own fear manifesting as physical pressure. I descended toward the bottom, the limestone floor rising to meet me. The fissure was there, the spring still flowing, but it looked different. The edges of the crack in the bedrock appeared jagged and raw, as if the opening had been forced wider from below. The current flowing out of it was stronger, pulsing with a rhythmic intensity that matched the beating of my own heart. I fought against the flow, pulling myself down into the opening, squeezing through the rock into the hidden chamber. Inside, the change was startling. The ancient structure in the center of the room, the cage of mangrove wood and coral, had broken open. The petrified vines had snapped, the wood had splintered, and the pieces lay scattered on the floor like the debris of an explosion. Through the gaps in the ruined architecture, I could see the entity clearly now. It was no longer huddled and dormant. It had unfurled. It was a pale, luminescent shape, hovering in the center of the chamber, suspended in the water. It did not have a fixed form. It seemed to shift and flow, suggesting limbs and features that dissolved as soon as I tried to focus on them. It looked ancient, something from the deep time of the earth, a biological memory of an era before humanity existed. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, a heartbeat of pure energy. As I finned closer, careful not to touch the walls or the entity itself, the presence in my mind returned. But this time, it was not a probing tendril. It was a tidal wave. It did not ask for permission. It flooded into me, filling every corner of my consciousness with a torrent of information. I was no longer observing the memory. I was living it. I saw the glaciers retreating thousands of miles to the north, the sea levels rising to swallow the continental shelf. I felt the earth shifting, the limestone growing layer by layer from the shells of billions of microscopic creatures. I saw the first forest taking root, the green tide sweeping across the land. I felt the arrival of the first humans, their awe and their fear as they discovered this place. I saw the faces of the keepers who had come before me, men and women of the Calusa, the Tequesta, the Seminole. I felt their devotion, their sacrifice, the heavy burden they carried so that their people could live in safety. I understood then that the entity was not evil. It was simply vast. It was a consciousness of the planet itself, a localized point of awareness that needed to be grounded in the human experience to remain stable. Without the anchor of human memory, it became volatile, a force of nature that sought to reshape the world to match its own internal reality. The storms, the floods, the chaos. These were not acts of malice, but the thrashing of a dreamer waking up in a strange room. The entity showed me what it wanted. It did not want freedom in the way a prisoner wants escape. It wanted connection. It wanted to be part of the story of the world, to be acknowledged as a living thread in the tapestry of existence. The binding was not a prison. It was a marriage, a union between the timeless earth and the fleeting human mind. I stopped fighting. I let go of my fear, my scientific detachment, my need to categorize and control. I opened myself to the experience, accepting the memories as my own. I let the history of the Everglades flow through me, etching itself into my neural pathways. I acknowledged the entity. I named it in my mind. I told it, I see you. I know you. You are here and I am here, and we are part of the same whole. The reaction was immediate. The violent pulsing of the entity slowed. The blinding light softened to a gentle glow. The chaotic flood of images settled into a coherent stream, a library of the earth that I could now access. The water in the chamber seemed to calm, the aggressive current easing into a gentle circulation. The entity began to recede, folding back on itself, returning to its dormant state within the ruins of the wooden structure. But as it settled, I felt a permanent change within myself. A weight settled onto my soul, a heaviness that I knew would never lift. I had taken on the burden. I was now the keeper. The memories of 10,000 years were now my memories. The solitude of the deep spring was now my solitude, carried with me wherever I went. I checked my air gauge. I had been down there for 20 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. I turned slowly, swimming back toward the fissure. The ascent was slow and dreamlike. When I broke the surface of the bay, the night air tasted sweet and impossibly light. I hauled myself into the boat, my limbs feeling heavy, my mind crowded with thoughts that were not entirely my own. Maria was there, her face pale with worry. She helped me off of the tank, her hands shaking. "You were down there a long time," she whispered. "Is it done?" I looked at her, and then back at the calm, black water. The oppressive feeling in the bay was gone. The silence was just silence now, not a held breath. The water was just water. "It's done," I said, my voice sounding older, deeper. "It sleeps." We motored out of the bay under the starlight, the boat cutting a smooth wake through the mangroves. I sat in the stern, watching the hidden entrance disappear into the darkness. I knew that the kayakers would recover. I knew that the research team would slowly find their way back to themselves, though they would always carry the scars of their encounter. But I also knew that for me, life would never be the same. I was walking in two worlds now. The world of the ranger station, of pizza with my daughter, of reports and schedules, and the world of the deep time of the silent, watching stone. I was the bridge, and I would have to be strong enough to hold the weight of both. The years that followed the summer 2003 moved with peculiar weight, distinct from the time I had known before. On the surface, life in the Everglades resumed its familiar rhythms. The seasons shifted from the wet heat of summer to the dry, cooler days of winter. Tourists returned in their Winnebagos and rental cars, eager to see an alligator or catch a glimpse of a roseate spoonbill. The tides rose and fell, washing the mudflats clean twice a day. To everyone else, the park was the same vast, beautiful wilderness it had always been. But for me, the landscape had fundamentally altered. It was no longer just a place of biology and geology. It was a living, breathing entity with which I shared a silent, constant dialogue. I returned to my duties as a ranger, patrolling the waterways, checking permits, and assisting lost boaters. But I did so with a new awareness. I could feel the pulse of the land beneath the hull of my boat. I could sense the shifting moods of the water. It was not a superpower, nor was it a hallucination. It was simply a deep, resonant knowing, a connection forged in the darkness of the spring. The memories I had accepted in the chamber, the visions of the Calusa, the geological shifts, the ancient storms, layered themselves over my daily perception. When I looked at a mangrove island, I saw not just the trees, but the centuries of growth and decay that had formed the soil beneath them. When I looked at the sky, I saw the patterns of weather that had shaped the peninsula over millennia. This connection came with a cost. The isolation I had always enjoyed as a ranger deepened into a profound solitude. It was difficult to connect with people in the same way I had before. Conversations about sports, politics, or the daily grind of park bureaucracy felt trivial, distant echoes of a world that seemed increasingly fragile. My marriage, already strained by the demands of my job, began to fracture under the weight of my silence. My wife, a patient and loving woman, tried to reach me. She asked what had changed, why I seemed to be living in a different place even when I was sitting right beside her at the dinner table. How could I explain that I was carrying the memory of the earth in my head? How could I tell her that a part of me was always standing in a submerged chamber, keeping watch over a sleeping God? I retreated into myself. We separated amicably a year later. It was a quiet dissolution, devoid of anger but filled with a sorrowful resignation. I moved into a small cabin near the park entrance, simplifying my life down to the essentials. My daughter, Elena, became the bright anchor in my drifting world. She was 9 then, full of curiosity and a love for the outdoors that mirrored my own. I cherished our weekends together, taking her out on the skiff, teaching her the names of the birds and the plants. But even with her, I was careful. I kept us away from the 10,000 islands. I steered clear of the deep springs. I watched her with protective intensity, terrified that she might have inherited my sensitivity, that the water might call to her as it had called to me. I also kept tabs on the others, the survivors of the 2003 incident. Dr. Haley Kravitz left the University of Miami 6 months after the rescue. She moved to Arizona, taking a teaching position at a university in the desert, as far from the ocean as she could get. We exchanged a few letters in the early years. She wrote a piece she found in the dry heat, in the solid, unmoving rock of the canyons. She never mentioned the water. Tom Hopkins dropped out of his graduate program and vanished into the corporate world, working for a logistics company in Atlanta. Dr. Morton retired early, moving to a cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains. They had all fled, seeking stability in the high ground, away from the fluid, memory-laden depths of the coast. I was the only one who stayed. I was the keeper. The decade passed slowly. 2004, 2005, 2006. Each year brought its own challenges. Hurricanes that reshaped the coastline, budget cuts that reduced our patrols, the encroachment of urban development on the edges of the park. But through it all, the entity in the spring remained dormant. The binding held. I could feel it, a low, steady hum in the back of my mind, a sense of equilibrium. I made solitary trips to the hidden bay once a year, not to dive, but simply to be there, to sit on the boat in the silence and acknowledge the presence below. It was a maintenance check, a reaffirmation of the pact. I am here, I would think. I remember. And the water would remain calm, the surface like black glass, reflecting the stars. But as 2013 approached, the atmosphere began to change. It was subtle at first, a restlessness in the wildlife, a shift in the migration patterns of the birds. The water in the back country seemed to grow darker, heavier. The feeling of equilibrium began to fray. I started waking up at night with the taste of salt water in my mouth, my heart racing from dreams of rising tides and crumbling stone. The 10-year cycle was turning again. The entity was stirring, testing the strength of the binding, pushing against the limits of the memory I held. I realized then that the ritual I had performed in 2003 was not a permanent fix. It was a temporary measure, a patch on a dam that was slowly failing. The entity was ancient, timeless. My human life, my single mind, was a finite vessel. I was aging. My memories were becoming crowded with the mundane details of survival. The signal was weakening. I needed to prepare. I needed to understand what the next step would be. The silence of the last decade was ending, and the water was getting ready to speak again. June 2013 arrived with a vengeance. The rainy season began early, bringing torrential downpours that flooded the sawgrass prairies and raised the water levels across the park. The humidity was suffocating, a physical weight that pressed down on the land. The air crackled with electricity, thunderstorms rolling in from the Gulf with a violence that felt personal. I was 50 years old now. My body was slower, my joints aching with the dampness, but my mind was sharpened by 10 years of carrying the burden. I knew the signs. I felt the calls starting to build, a low-frequency vibration that hummed in my teeth and rattled my bones. It was not just calling me this time. It was broadcasting a wideband signal reaching out to anyone susceptible enough to hear it. The first incident happened on June 4th. A family of tourists from Germany, a mother, father, and teenage son, rented a canoe from the Gulf Coast Ranger Station. They filed a float plan for a simple day trip along the coastal mangroves. They never returned. When the report came in, I was already in my boat. I didn't need coordinates this time. I felt the location like a hook in my chest, pulling me toward the southwest, toward the hidden bay. I radioed Maria, who was now the district ranger, her voice carrying the authority of her rank, but the same underlying worry she had held 10 years ago. "Oscar, don't tell me," she said, her voice tight. "The 10,000 islands? It's starting again, Maria." I said, "The cycle. It's 10 years. The family is being drawn to the bay. We have boats in the water," she said. "We're launching a full search. But Oscar, be careful. You're not the same man you were 10 years ago." "None of us are," I replied and turned the throttle. The journey to the bay was a fight against the elements. The weather had turned foul. Gray clouds boiling overhead, rain lashing the water in sheets. The mangroves whipped in the wind, their branches thrashing like desperate arms. The water in the channels was choppy and confused, currents swirling in unpredictable eddies. It felt as though the Everglades itself was agitated, the immune system of the landscape reacting to an infection. When I reached the hidden entrance to the bay, I had to fight the current to get through. The water was rushing out of the bay, a strong outflow that shouldn't have been there. It was as if the spring below had increased its flow 100-fold, pushing water out into the ocean. I forced the boat through the narrow gap, the engines straining. Inside, the bay was a scene of eerie calm amidst the storm. The wind howled above the mangrove canopy, but down on the water, the air was still. The surface was roiling, not from wind, but from below. Bubbles were breaking the surface, large pockets of gas and water rising from the deep. The canoe was there, drifting near the center. The family was sitting in it, slumped over, drenching wet from the rain. I pulled alongside and boarded their small craft. They were alive, but deeply unconscious. Their skin was pale, cold to the touch. They weren't sunburned this time. They were hypothermic, despite the warm air. It was as if the life heat was being drawn out of them, sucked down into the deep. I checked the father's pulse. It was dangerously slow. As I touched him, his eyes snapped open. They were completely black, the pupils dilated so wide they swallowed the iris. He grabbed my wrist with a grip of surprising strength. "It is time to wake," he rasped, the voice not his own. "The stone is broken. The water is rising. We are the first drops of flood." I pulled my hand away, shivering. This was different. In 2003, the victims had been passive, witnesses to a memory. Now, they were vessels for a message. The entity wasn't just asking to be remembered. It was announcing its arrival. I transferred the family to my boat, working with desperate speed. I radioed for the Coast Guard, giving them a rendezvous point in the main channel, away from this haunted place. As I motored out, towing the empty canoe, I looked back at the center of the bay. The water was churning violently now, a whirlpool forming above the spring. The color had shifted from black to a milky, pale green, the color of pulverized limestone. The bedrock itself was grinding apart. After handling the evacuation and ensuring the family was on their way to the hospital, I returned to the ranger station. I sat in my office, the rain drumming on the metal roof. I was shaking. The binding I had performed, the sacrifice of my own memory and peace, had bought us a decade. But it wasn't enough. The entity had grown stronger, or perhaps the world had grown weaker. The physical prison was failing. I realized then that I could not do this alone anymore. The Lone Ranger mentality, the idea of the solitary hero bearing the burden, was a fallacy. It was a remnant of an old way of thinking. The entity was a collective consciousness, a vast network of memory. To bind it, to truly stabilize it, required a network of our own. I needed help. I needed people who understood the old ways and the new science. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Hello." A woman's voice answered, wary and distant. "Haley," I said. "It's Oscar. It's happening again." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear the wind blowing in the desert on her end, a dry, hollow sound. "I know," she whispered. "I've been dreaming about the water for weeks. I can feel the dampness in my lungs." "I need you to come back," I said. "Not to dive, not to go into the water, but I need your mind. I need to understand what is happening to the geology down there, and I need to find the others. We need a circle. One person isn't enough to hold the door anymore. Oscar," she hesitated. "I swore I'd never go back to Florida." "I know," I said gently, "but the water remembers you, Haley. You're already part of it. We can't run from this. If the binding breaks completely, it won't just be the Everglades that floods. It will be everything." She let out a shaky breath. "I'll be on the first flight tomorrow." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the storm. The rain was falling harder now, blurring the world into a gray wash. The rising tide was coming, but this time I wouldn't be standing against it alone. We would build a new wall, not of stone, but shared will. The cycle of 2013 had begun, and the battle for the memory of the earth was about to change. Dr. Haley Kravitz arrived 2 days later. The woman who stepped off the plane at Miami International Airport was different from the vibrant young researcher I had met a decade ago. The desert sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, and her movements were more measured, guarded. But when she saw me, her expression softened into a look of shared recognition. We were veterans of the same silent, invisible journey, carrying the same scars on our memories. We hugged briefly, a clumsy embrace that spoke of relief and shared burden. "You look tired, Oscar," she said, her voice dry and steady. "I feel tired," I admitted. "The water is heavy these days." We drove south in silence, the landscape shifting from the concrete sprawl of the city to the green expanse of the agricultural fields, and finally to the sawgrass horizon of the park. I took her to my cabin, where I had set up a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, not just navigational charts, but geological surveys, hydrological maps, and copies of the ancient Calusa diagrams I had sourced from the archives in Jimmy Oyola. Haley studied them with the intensity of the scientist she had once been. "It's not just the one spring, is it?" she asked, tracing a line along the limestone ridge that ran beneath the peninsula. "No," I said. "It's a network. The spring in the 10,000 islands is just one vent, but the pressure is building across the entire system. The aquifer is connected. If the binding fails there, it will destabilize the whole platform." "And the others?" she asked, turning to me. "Did you find them?" "I tried," I said, pointing to a list of names on the desk. "Tom Hopkins is in Atlanta. He won't take my calls. His wife says he has episodes where he stands in the shower for hours, just letting the water run over him. He's terrified. Dr. Morton is in the mountains. He's unreachable. His mind has retreated too far. So it's just us," Haley said quietly. "Just us and Maria," I added, "and maybe one other." We spent the next week preparing. Haley brought her expertise in marine geology, helping me understand the physical changes happening in the bay. She explained that the limestone bedrock of Florida is porous, like a sponge. The entity wasn't just living in a cave. It was permeating the stone itself, a consciousness diffused through the rock. The body I had seen in 2003 was just a focal point, a manifestation created to interact with us. The real entity was the aquifer itself. The disturbances in the park grew worse. Fish kills were reported in the backcountry, Thousands of silver bodies floating on the surface, their eyes cloudy. The water in the bays turned strange colors, milky white, sulphurous yellow, deep bruised purple. The tourists noticed. The Park Service noticed. But they called it algal blooms and seasonal fluctuations. We knew better. It was the entity thrashing in its sleep, the fevered dreams of the earth manifesting in the water chemistry. On June 18th, exactly 10 years and 1 day since the 2003 event, the call came again. But this time, it wasn't a distress signal from a lost boater. It was a feeling. I woke up at 3 a.m., gasping for air, my skin cold and clammy. I felt a pull so strong it was almost physical, a hook in my solar plexus dragging me toward the water. I found Haley standing on the porch of the cabin, staring south into the darkness. She was shivering. "It's time," she whispered. "It's awake." We drove to Flamingo in silence. Maria met us at the dock. She had the boat ready, fueled and loaded with gear. She looked at Haley and then at me. "You're going back down," she stated. "I have to," I said. "The binding is broken. The family the other day, they were the warning shot. If I don't go down and reestablish the connection, the next surge won't be a kayaker. It will be a tidal wave." "I'm coming with you," Haley said. Her voice wavered, but her eyes were hard. "I can't dive. I can't go into the chamber. But I can be the anchor. I can stay on the boat and hold the line. If you get lost in the memory, I can pull you back." We set out into the night. The water was rough, the wind whipping the bay into a frenzy. The journey to the 10,000 islands felt like navigating a hostile planet. The mangroves seemed to lean in, grasping at the boat. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and rot. When we reached the hidden entrance, the current was so strong I had to rev the engines to the red line just to push through. The bay inside was a cauldron. The water was boiling, churning with released gases. The ancient wooden platform was gone, swallowed by the rising water or destroyed by the turbulence. In the center of the bay, a vortex was forming, a slow, swirling depression that sucked floating debris down into the dark. "It's wide open," I shouted over the roar of the water. "The fissure has collapsed. It's a sinkhole now." I geared up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely buckle my weight belt. This was different from 2003. This wasn't a ritual. It was a rescue mission. I wasn't just going to witness a sleeping god. I was going to the mouth of a waking storm. "Oscar," Haley grabbed my arm. "Remember who you are. Don't let it dissolve you. You're Oscar Cook. You have a daughter. You live on the land. Hold on to that." I nodded, unable to speak. I put my regulator in my mouth, rolled over the side, and let the vortex take me. The descent was chaotic. There was no swimming involved. The suction of the inflow dragged me down like a rag doll. I fought to equalize my ears, the pressure building rapidly. My dive light was a useless beam of white in a world of churning silt and debris. I was tumbling, spinning, disoriented in the dark. Then, abruptly, the turbulence ceased. I was ejected into a space of absolute stillness. I stabilized myself and shone my light around. I was in the chamber, but it had changed. It was massive now. The walls had fallen away, revealing a vast, cavernous space that stretched beyond the reach of my light. The floor was gone, replaced by a deep, dark abyss that went down into the roots of the world. And hovering in the center of this void was the entity. It was no longer the pale, shifting shape I had seen before. It was enormous. It filled the space, a towering construct of light and shadow, bioluminescence and rock. It looked like a nervous system stripped bare, a network of glowing filaments that pulsed with rhythm that matched the tectonic shifting of the earth. I felt its attention focus on me. It was heavy, crushing. It didn't gently probe my mind this time. It slammed into me. "You have returned." The voice wasn't sound. It was a vibration that rattled my teeth. It wasn't angry. It was simply immense. It was the voice of a mountain speaking to an ant. The binding is ended. The cycle is complete. I rise. No. I shouted into my regulator, the sound muffled and tiny. I projected the thought as hard as I could. You cannot rise. If you rise, you destroy the world that remembers you. You destroy the minds that give you shape. The entity paused. The pulsing light slowed. They have forgotten. The memory is thin. It does not sustain me. It showed me images of the modern world. Cities of concrete that paved over springs. Canals that drained the lifeblood of the aquifer. People walking with their heads down, staring at screens, disconnected from the land, deaf to the song of the water. It showed me a world that had severed its roots. Why should I sleep for a world that is dead? I felt a wave of despair. It was right. We had forgotten. We had traded the sacred for the convenient. But then I thought of Elena. I thought of her face when she looked at the ocean, the wonder in her eyes. I thought of Haley, standing on the boat above, facing her trauma to help me. I thought of Jimmy Oyola, keeping the fire burning in the darkness. Not everyone I projected. There are still those who remember. There are still those who listen. I opened my mind fully. I didn't just accept the entity's memories this time. I offered my own. I showed it the love of a father for his daughter. I showed it the quiet dedication of a ranger protecting a nest of sea turtle eggs. I showed it the beauty of a sunrise over the sawgrass, appreciated by a human heart. I showed it that humanity was not just concrete and indifference. We were also love and awe and stewardship. We are still here, I pleaded. We are still the witnesses. Sleep, sleep, and let us remember you. The entity hesitated. The massive network of light shimmered. It was tasting the emotions I offered. It was examining the quality of my memory. It was feeding on the raw, human connection I was pouring into the void. For a moment, I thought I was going to be consumed. My mind felt like it was being stretched thin, turning into a mist that would dissipate into the water. I was losing myself. The boundaries of Oscar Cook were dissolving. I was becoming just another current in the spring. Oscar, a voice cut through the static. Clear, sharp, human. It was Haley. She was projecting to me, using the connection we had forged. She was pulling on the rope of our shared experience. Oscar, come back. You are not the water. You are the rock. Hold on. Her presence was a lifeline. I grabbed onto it. I used her voice to reassemble my fractured self. I pushed back against the entity, not with force, but with definition. I am Oscar, I asserted. I am the keeper. And I say, sleep. The entity shuddered. The great lights dimmed. The chaotic swirling of the water slowed. The vast, expanding form began to contract, folding back on itself, retreating into the stone. The witness is accepted. The memory is renewed. 10 years. The voice faded into a rumble, then into silence. The current reversed gently, lifting me up. I ascended through the dark water, rising toward the faint, green glow of the surface. I broke the water gasping, ripping my mask off. The storm above had broken. The rain had stopped. The moon was shining through a gap in the clouds, illuminating the bay. The water was calm again. Haley hauled me into the boat. We collapsed on the deck, soaking wet, shivering, exhausted beyond words. We lay there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the water lapping against the hull. Is it done? She asked finally, her voice a whisper. For now, I said, for another 10 years. But as I looked up at the stars, I knew it wasn't the same. The entity was restless. The world was changing too fast. The old ways of binding one man, one memory were reaching their limit. We had bought time, but the clock was ticking faster. The next time, we would need more than just a ranger and a scientist. We would need a new way. We can't do this alone next time, I said, sitting up. Haley nodded, looking at the dark water. No, we need to find others. We need to teach them. We need to prepare. The boat engine roared to life, a mechanical sound that felt comforting in its normalcy. We headed back toward Flamingo, leaving the hidden bay behind. But we carried the silence with us, the long silence of the deep, waiting for the next turn of the wheel. The aftermath of 2013 was a period of reconstruction, not of the physical world, but of our understanding. Haley did not return to Arizona. She stayed in South Florida, taking a quiet research position at a small environmental institute in the Keys. We rented a small house near the water, one with a view of the bay, but grounded firmly on limestone bedrock. We lived separately but worked together daily, two survivors building a raft to weather the next storm. We knew that the method of the single keeper, the solitary soul bearing the weight of the memory, was obsolete. The entity was too vast, and the modern world too distracting, for one mind to hold the line. The near collapse in the chamber had proven that. If Haley hadn't been there to anchor me, I would have dissolved into the spring, and the binding would have failed. We needed a stronger structure. We needed a network. We began by mapping the aquifer, using ground-penetrating radar data, geological surveys, and the intuitive sense I had developed. We traced the subterranean veins of water that flowed beneath Florida. We discovered that the spring in the 10,000 Islands was not an isolated anomaly. It was a major node in a web that stretched from the Panhandle to the Keys. There were 7 primary sites, 7 vents where the deep consciousness of the Earth came closest to the surface. One was a blue hole in the Gulf. Another was a sinkhole in the middle of a dense pine forest near Orlando. A third was hidden beneath the dark waters of the St. Johns River. Each one was a pressure point. Each one needed a witness. We reached out to the others. It was a delicate task. We couldn't exactly put out an advertisement for guardians of ancient entities. We had to find people who were already sensitive, people who had been touched by the water in some way. We found a cave diver in High Springs who had seen strange lights in the deep tunnels. We found a Seminole woman who still knew the songs of her grandmother. We found a retired hydrologist who had spent his life trying to explain data anomalies that science couldn't quantify. We brought them together one by one. We met in quiet places, back rooms of libraries, screened porches at sunset, the edges of deserted beaches. We told them the truth. Not all of it at once, but enough. We spoke of the memory of the earth. We spoke of the duty to witness. Most of them already knew, on some level. They had felt the call in their dreams. They had heard the hum in the silence. They were relieved to find a language of their experience, to know they were not alone. We taught them. I shared the mental techniques I had learned, how to open the mind without losing the self, how to compartmentalize a flood of alien memory, how to use an emotional anchor to stay grounded. Haley taught them the science, the geology, the hydrology, the mechanics of the aquifer. We were building a priesthood of sorts, but one based on geology and psychology rather than dogma. But as we worked, I watched my daughter, Elena, with growing anxiety. She was 18 now, a young woman of fierce intelligence and a wild, untamable love for the ocean. She was studying marine biology, following in Haley's footsteps. I tried to keep her away from the deeper truths. I wanted her to have a normal life, a life of sunshine and surface waves, not the crushing weight of the deep dark. But the bloodline is a powerful current. One evening in 2017, Elena came to me. She had been out on a research trip in the Keys, collecting samples near a coral reef. She looked pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard something underwater today. It wasn't a whale. It wasn't a boat. It was a voice. It sounded like the rocks were singing." My heart sank. I looked at Haley, who was sitting at the kitchen table. She gave me a sad, knowing nod. We couldn't protect her by hiding the truth. Ignorance was what had nearly killed the research teams. Understanding was the only shield. I sat Elena down. I told her everything. I told her about 2003, about the hidden bay, about the entity. I expected her to be terrified. I expected her to run, to think I was crazy. Instead, she listened with a focused intensity. When I finished, she didn't cry. She looked out the window at the dark ocean and said, simply, "I know. I've always known. I just didn't know what it was." She joined our circle. She was a natural. Her mind was flexible, open in a way mine wasn't. She didn't fight the connection. She surfed it. She brought a new perspective, a younger energy. She suggested that the entity wasn't just a burden to be carried, but a partner to be understood. She talked about symbiosis, about coexistence. We were 7 now. The circle was complete. We had a keeper for each of the major sites. We began to practice synchronization. On the solstices and equinoxes, we would go to our respective springs. We wouldn't dive deep. We would just sit by the water, open our minds, and link up. It was a strange sensation, feeling the consciousness of 6 other people humming in your head, a web of human thought laid over the vast, slow thoughts of the earth. It worked. The disturbances in the park ceased. The water cleared. The fish kills stopped. The entities seemed to settle into a deep, restful sleep, soothed by the chorus of minds that acknowledged it. For a few years, we thought we had solved it. We thought we had found the permanent fix. But the world was changing faster than we anticipated. The climate was shifting. The seas were rising, pressing salt water into the freshwater aquifers. The cities were expanding, their foundations vibrating the bedrock. We were stabilizing the spiritual connection, but the physical vessel, the earth itself, was under assault. We were calming the passenger, but the car was shaking apart. The year 2020 brought a global stillness that, paradoxically, gave the earth a moment to breathe. The reduction in travel, the slowing of industry, the quietude that fell over the human world. It resonated in the aquifer. The entities seemed deeper asleep than ever, lulled by the reduction in surface vibration. We used this time to strengthen our network, to deepen our understanding of the link. We met over video calls, discussing the subtle shifts in the water, comparing notes on our dreams. It felt like a period of grace, a calm before the inevitable return of the storm. But as the world roared back to life in 2021 and 2022, the pressure returned with compounded force. And this time it was different. It wasn't just the entity waking up. It was the environment collapsing around it. In late 2022, the keeper of the Blue Hole, a stoic diver named Marcus, reported a change. "The water is tasting different," he told us during one of our nightly briefings. "It's not just salty. It's bitter, metallic, and the temperature is spiking." Then the reports came from the Orlando site. The sinkhole was expanding. The ground around was cracking, fissures opening up in the dry earth. The entity there was agitated, sending spikes of panic through the link. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the past. It was a frantic, staccato beat. Haley analyzed the data. Her face was grim when she presented her findings to the group. "Saltwater intrusion," she said. "The rising sea levels are pushing the saltwater wedge further inland. It's penetrating the freshwater aquifer. The chemistry of the springs is changing. The entity, it lives in the freshwater. The salt is burning it." This was a catastrophe we hadn't planned for. We had focused on the spiritual binding, on the memory. We hadn't considered that the physical habitat of the consciousness was being destroyed. The entity wasn't waking up because it was forgotten. It was waking up because its house was on fire. Elena was the one who proposed a dive. "We need to ask it," she said. "We need to go down and ask what it needs. We can't just keep singing it lullabies while it's in pain." I argued against it. It's too dangerous. If it's in pain, it will be volatile. It could lash out. "Dad," she said, her voice firm, "we don't have a choice. The network is fraying. Marcus can barely hold his link. If we lose one node, the whole web collapses. I'm going down. I'm the strongest swimmer. I have the best connection." I wanted to forbid her. I wanted to lock her in her room like a child. But she was a woman grown, and she was right. She was the best of us. We gathered at the hidden bay in the 10,000 Islands. It was December 2022. The water was gray and choppy under a winter sky. The mangroves looked ragged, battered by a recent hurricane. The 7 of us stood on the deck of the research boat, me, Haley, Elena, and the others. We formed a physical circle, holding hands, grounding ourselves before the descent. Elena suited up. She looked small in her gear, but her eyes were clear and fearless. "I'll be quick," she promised. "I'm just going to the threshold. I'm just going to listen." I watched her slip into the water. The splash was swallowed by the gray waves. I sat on the gunwale, closing my eyes, reaching out with my mind to follow her down. I felt her descent. I felt the cold water, the pressure building. I felt her approach the chamber. And then I felt the entity. It was screaming. It wasn't a sound. It was a psychic shear, a jagged tear in the fabric of the mind. Burning. The salt. The intrusion. The walls are falling. Elena didn't flinch. I felt her project calm, a cool blue light in the red chaos. "We are here," she told it. "We see the pain. What can we do?" The response was a deluge of images. It showed us the coastlines eroding. It showed us the great freshwater domes beneath the land shrinking, contaminated by the sea. It showed us that the binding, the static containment, was no longer viable. It couldn't stay in the specific springs anymore. They were becoming uninhabitable. "Move me," the entity commanded. The roots must move. It was asking to migrate. It wanted to shift its consciousness from a compromised coastal vents to the deeper, more protected aquifers in the north. But it couldn't do it alone. It was bound to the locations by thousands of years of ritual. It was anchored by the very memories we had been feeding it. Elena gasped underwater. I heard it over the comms. "It wants us to release it," she said. "It wants us to break the binding. If we break the binding," Haley said, her face pale, "it wakes up fully. It could destroy everything in the transition." "Not if we guide it," Elena said. "We have to be the conduit. We have to be the river. We have to carry the memory from the old sites to the new ones. We have to walk it north." It was an impossible task. We were talking about moving a geological spirit across hundreds of miles of rock and water, using 7 human minds as the vessel. Elena surfaced. She climbed back onto the boat, dripping wet, her eyes burning with a strange intensity. "We have until the summer solstice," she said. "June 2023. That's when the tides will be highest. That's when the salt will breach the inner chamber. We have 6 months to figure out how to move a god." The circle fell silent. We looked at each other, 7 people standing on a boat in a dying bay, realizing that the job of keeper had just changed. We were no longer guards. We were about to become guides on the most dangerous journey in human history. The era of the hidden bay was ending. The era of the migration was about to begin. The 6th month that followed felt both impossibly short and endlessly long, like standing on a shore watching a distant storm roll closer in slow motion, knowing that when it arrived, every grain of sand beneath your feet might shift. Our small circle, once focused on maintaining a static balance, now had to prepare for a journey unlike anything we had imagined. We were no longer just caretakers of a sleeping presence. We were about to become companions on its passage. We approached the task with the same mixture of practicality and reverence that had guided us so far. Haley translated the entity's plea into the language of science, building models of groundwater flow, simulating how energy and memory might travel through the porous limestone from south to north. She spoke of hydraulic gradients, flow paths, and confining layers, but beneath the technical terms was a simple truth. The land itself held pathways we could guide, if we listened carefully enough. Elena focused on the inner work. She designed a mental and emotional practice for us, a kind of shared meditation tuned to the steady rhythm of the aquifer. Each evening, spread across the state, we would set aside an hour to sit by water, be a spring, river, canal, or even a bowl on a kitchen table, and connect. We would breathe slowly, Imagine roots descending from our bodies into stone and gently reach for each other's presence. At first, these sessions were clumsy. Minds wandered, distractions crept in, and the link felt thin and brittle. But we persisted. Little by little, a quiet familiarity grew between us. We learned the subtle textures of each other's thoughts, the way Marcus's attention always carried an undercurrent of curiosity, how the Seminole singer's presence felt like a low, steady drum, how Haley's mind moved with the precision of a measured instrument. Elena's energy ran through the network like a bright, flowing current, weaving us together. My own role in the circle was less about brilliance and more about steadiness. I had spent decades listening to the land. Now that habit of patient attention became an anchor for everyone else. We chose the date for the crossing carefully, the summer solstice of 2023. On that day, the sun would stand at its highest, the tidal cycles at their widest, and the gravitational balances most receptive to change. It felt right, in a way that went beyond astronomy. There was something deeply reassuring about aligning our small, human-scale plan with patterns older than our species. The weeks leading up to the solstice were filled with a gentle kind of tension. There were no sirens or alarms, only a persistent sense of approaching threshold. We visited each of the 7 sites in person, one by one, to attune ourselves to their particular character. The blue hole in the Gulf, where the water turned an impossible shade of sapphire over a hidden shaft in the rock. The forest sinkhole, ringed by tall pines that whispered in the slightest breeze. The slow, tea-colored river where tannins painted the surface in copper and gold. At each place, we stood in silence, let our hands brush the water, and said quietly in our hearts, "We are here. We remember." On the morning of the solstice, the sky over the Everglades was a muted gray, the light soft and diffuse. There were no dramatic signs, no sudden storms, just a calm that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were pausing to listen. Elena and I traveled together by boat to the hidden bay one last time. The path through the mangroves felt less menacing than it once had. Perhaps I had simply grown used to its narrow turns, or perhaps the land had grown accustomed to us. The bay, when we arrived, was still. The water was deep, but no longer angry. It had the look of a mirror that knew what it was about to reflect. At the appointed hour, each of the 7 keepers took their place. Marcus floated above the blue hole, anchored to a buoy. The forest guardian sat cross-legged at the edge of the sinkhole, her feet dangling over the dark water. Haley waited on the banks of quiet canal near Homestead, where groundwater seeped to the surface in a slow, invisible rise. Elena stood on the research boat beside me, one hand lightly touching the surface of the bay. I could feel the small tremor in her fingers, a blend of anticipation and responsibility. We closed our eyes and reached for each other. The connection came faster than it ever had, as if the months of practice had carved channels in the invisible landscape between our minds. I felt the presence of each friend settle around me, a constellation of familiar lights. Beneath and between us, deeper and slower, waited the immense awareness we had sworn to tend. The presence that had watched glaciers retreat, seas advance, and forests rise and fall. Elena spoke first, not aloud, but through the shared space we had created. She did not use complicated words or elaborate images. She simply offered a feeling, the sense of opening a door not to release chaos, but to invite a guest into a safer room. One by one, we joined her, adding our own quiet affirmations. There was no dramatic chant, no shouted command, only a collective willingness, steady and clear. The entity responded. It did not surge or roar. It expanded gently, like a breath taken after too long underwater. I felt it stirring in the limestone beneath the bay, then sliding along the hidden channels we had mapped, moving northward not as a single object, but as a change in the quality of the stone itself. In my mind's eye, it looked like light soaking through cloth, advancing from one fold to the next. At each of the other sites, the keepers felt it arrive, a softening of pressure, a new sense of presence. As it moved, it brushed against our thoughts. There was a warmth to that contact now, a recognition. It showed us memories of deep, cool caverns far below the reach of salt water, places where the freshwater domes were still thick and pure, protected by layers of dense rock. These would be its new resting places. Not one single chamber, but many, distributed and resilient, like a tree whose life no longer depended on a single root. For a long time, we stayed there in that quiet, shared awareness, simply accompanying the passage. There were moments of strain, when the pressure of so much memory moving at once threatened to blur the edges of our individual selves. Each time, someone in the circle would offer a fragment of ordinary humanity to steady us, a remembered song, the taste of morning coffee, the look of sunlight on a child's face. These small, grounded images were like stepping stones across a wide, fast river. When at last the movement eased, we knew without words that the main part crossing was complete. The entity rested now in deeper aquifers across a broader span of land, its awareness diffused but intact. The springs we had known would never be quite the same. Some would dry, others would become ordinary pools of water, their hidden charge gone. It was a change, but not an ending. We opened our eyes to the physical world again. The bay looked almost unchanged, but I could feel the difference the way a person feels the absence of a long-held weight. The oppressive undercurrent was gone. The water seemed simply itself, dark, tidal, and filled with the ordinary, quiet life of the mangroves. Elena let out a long breath and leaned her head on my shoulder. For the first time in many years, the space inside my mind felt spacious, not because the memories had disappeared, but because they were now part of something wider and more stable than my single skull could ever be. We had not released our responsibility. We had shared it both with each other and with the land itself. The solstice sun climbed higher, hidden behind its gentle veil of clouds. The day went on. Boats passed in the distance, unaware of the passage that had just taken place beneath their keels. That was as it should be. Not every story needs to be shouted. Some are meant to be carried quietly, like a secret name, spoken only when the land and the water call for it. In the years that followed the crossing, life settled into a new kind of normal. The 7 of us remained in touch, though the urgent daily meetings faded into occasional check-ins, like friends who had survived the same long journey, and now met to share how the road had changed them. Each of us stayed near our chosen site, not as guards standing watch over a prison, but as neighbors living beside an old, wise companion. The physical signs of the change appeared slowly. Some of the springs we had known lost their unusual character, becoming calmer, less charged spaces. Tourists still came to swim in the clear water, unaware that the presence that had once watched them from beneath had moved on. In other places, unexpected seeps and small pools appeared in the interior, where no visible spring had been before. Hydrologists scratched their heads and updated their maps. We watched quietly and felt a familiar hum in these new places, a comforting sign that the entity had found fresh rooms in the house of stone. For me, the greatest change came at home. Elena did not leave Florida. Offers came from universities, research vessels, organizations scattered across the world, but she chose to build her life here, in the loose, living edge between land and sea. She took a position as a coastal scientist, studying how rising waters reshaped shorelines and how ecosystems adapted. To her colleagues, she was a gifted researcher with an unusually intuitive grasp of subtle patterns. To me, she was something more, the next in a line of keepers, but also the first of a new kind. We never framed it as a burden when we spoke together. When she came by my cabin after long days in the field, we would sit on the small porch overlooking the low marsh and talk not just about data and maps, but about the quiet messages that drifted up from the bedrock. Sometimes she would fall silent mid-sentence, her gaze distant, and then return with a simple observation, that the deep currents beneath the state felt steady, or that one of the northern aquifers seemed restless, as if waiting for rain that had not yet come. These impressions were no longer overwhelming visions, just gentle nudges, like a neighbor tapping on the wall to say hello. I aged as people do, and the memories of my mind softened at the edges, blending with the countless small details of an ordinary life. I worried as the years went by that the clarity of my connection would fade beyond usefulness. But whenever that concern rose too loudly, the network reminded me that I was not carrying this alone anymore. There were other minds now, younger and more flexible, ready to hold what I put down. The entity itself seemed content with this arrangement. It did not demand constant attention, only honest acknowledgement from time to time, and a few moments of shared presence when the seasons turned. One afternoon, some years after the solstice crossing, Elena took me to a place she had discovered inland, far from the mangroves and tidal creeks that had defined so much of my life. It was a small, clear pool nestled in a grove of oaks and palmettos, fed by a spring that bubbled up through white sand at the bottom. The air there was cooler than the surroundings, touched by a faint mineral sweetness. "This is one of the new rooms," she said quietly, kneeling at the edge. "You can feel it, can't you?" I closed my eyes and reached out with a sense I had lived with for so long. It was like touching a familiar melody played in a different key. The same calm depth, the same slow intelligence, but expressed through another facet of the stone. There was no strain in that contact, no overwhelming flood of images. It was simply a presence and a recognition. We sat there for a long time, saying very little. A dragonfly skimmed the surface of the water. Somewhere in the distance, a dove called. The world around us moved at its own unhurried pace. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked eventually, letting it in, carrying all of that. I thought about the long nights in my cabin, the early years when the weight had felt almost unbearable, when every creak of the floorboards had sounded like echoes from the spring. I thought about the strain of those deep dives, the risk of losing myself entirely. But then I thought of the moments of clarity, the way storms made sense in a new way once I understood the story of the land beneath them, the sense of companionship I felt standing alone on a dock at night, knowing that the silence was not empty. There were difficult seasons, I said honestly, times when it felt too much. But regret is not the word I would use. It gave me a way to belong, to this place, to its history. And it gave me you, I added with a small smile. If not for all that, our paths might have been different. I might never have known you as I do now, not just as my daughter, but as someone who can hear what most of the world ignores. She leaned her head against my shoulder, just as she had on that solstice morning years before. The gesture felt both old and new, an echo and a beginning. The tide of generations was moving on, as it always does, carrying the story forward. As twilight settled over the grove, I felt a gentle stirring beneath us, like a slow nod of acknowledgement from the water and stone. There was no urgency in it, no demand, only a quiet assurance that as long as someone listened, as long as even a handful of people were willing to remember the deep time beneath their feet, the balance could be tended, not controlled, not perfected, but cared for. The Everglades, the springs, the rivers, and the hidden caverns would continue to change with the climate, with the rising seas, with the choices of millions of people. There would be new challenges, new forms of tension and renewal, but there would also be new listeners, new keepers who might never know my name or the details of summer 2003, yet would feel the same subtle pull towards certain waters, the same sense that the land was not just backdrop, but participant. As the first stars appeared between the branches overhead, Elena stood and offered me a hand. We walked back along the sandy path together, our footsteps soft, our shared silence easy. Somewhere deep below, in the cool dark of the aquifer, an ancient awareness rested, cradled not by walls of brittle stone alone, but by a network of living minds and changing shores. The story was no longer about one ranger and one hidden bay. It was about a world learning, very slowly, to remember itself. The year 2023 marked the turning point, but the years that followed were an education in a much broader reality. We had thought, in our limited human scope, that the migration of the entity was a singular event, a local crisis solved by a small group of dedicated people in Florida. We believed we had saved our corner of the world and could rest. But the water cycle is not local. The aquifers of the world are not islands. They are veins in a single body, separated by oceans and continents on the surface, but connected by the deep physics of the planet. As 2024 bled into 2025, the network began to receive new signals. At first, we dismissed them as echoes, the residual vibrations of the Great Crossing, but they were distinct. They were not coming from the north, where our entity had settled. They were coming from everywhere. Elena was the first to recognize the pattern. She'd been collaborating with a team of hydrogeologists in the Yucatan Peninsula, studying the cenotes, the vast, submerged sinkholes that riddle the Mexican coast. During a video call one evening, she looked troubled. "Dad," she said, her voice tinny over the laptop speakers. "I met a local diver today. He told me a story about the guardian of the cenote. He said his grandfather used to sing to the water to keep the guardian asleep. But he said the song stopped 2 generations ago, and now the water is restless." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Restless how?" I asked. "Turbulence. Strange currents. People feeling a heavy presence when they swim," she replied. "It sounds exactly like the bay in 2003. We reached out to our contacts. The scientific community is small, but the community of people who listen to the Earth is even smaller and surprisingly interconnected. We heard whispers from the Australian outback, where indigenous elders spoke of the rainbow serpent stirring in the deep waterholes. We heard reports from the springs of Iceland, where the geothermal vents were pulsing with a rhythm that defied volcanic explanation. We heard from the peat bogs of Ireland and the deep lakes of Siberia. The message was clear. The awakening we had experienced in Florida was not an isolated incident. It was part of a planetary shift. The environmental changes, the warming, the rising seas, the shifting tectonic stresses, were affecting the deep consciousness of the Earth globally. The ancient bindings, maintained by disparate cultures for millennia, were all fraying at once. The entities were waking up. This realization could have been terrifying. It could have sparked panic. But for our circle, seasoned by 20 years of contact, it felt like an invitation. We understood now that these entities were not monsters to be feared or demons to be banished. They were the memory of the planet. They were the consciousness of the biosphere itself, stored in the deep geology. Their waking was not an attack. It was a response. They were waking up because the world needed them. The planet was changing so rapidly that the deep mind needed to come online to process the trauma, to help navigate the transition. We organized a summit, not in a hotel or a conference center, but online, a digital campfire that spanned the globe. We connected with the dreamers in Mexico, the song keepers in Australia, the mystics in Europe. We shared our story. We told them about the migration, about the network of minds, about the shift from binding to partnership. It was a delicate process. Every culture had its own language of phenomenon, its own protocols and taboos. We had to be respectful, to listen more than we spoke. But the underlying truth was universal. The water remembers, and the water is asking for help. Elena became our ambassador. Her youth, her scientific training, and her deep intuitive gift made her the perfect bridge. She traveled to Mexico, then to Hawaii, then to New Zealand. She didn't go to teach. She went to compare notes. She sat with elders and scientists, weaving a tapestry of understanding. She called me from a cliffside in Portugal, the wind whipping her hair. "They're not angry, Dad," she said, her voice full of awe. "None of them are angry. They're just confused. They've been asleep for so long, and they woke up in a world that's hurting. They want to help. They want to stabilize the systems. But they need us to be the interface. They need us to ground them in the present moment." We realized that the era of the keeper, the solitary guard holding the door shut, was over. We were entering the era of the interpreters. Our job was no longer to force the entities to sleep. It was to help them wake up gently. It was to help them integrate into the modern world without causing catastrophic displacement. We needed to build a global network of human minds that could act as a buffer, a filtering system that allowed the deep wisdom of the earth to rise without shattering the surface. It was a massive undertaking. We were talking about a spiritual infrastructure project on a planetary scale. But we started small. We taught the Mexican divers the meditation techniques we had developed. We shared our data with the Australian rangers. We built a library of songs, not just musical notes, but mental frequencies, emotional states that soothed the water. And as we worked, we felt the shift. The chaotic signals from the earth began to harmonize. The sense of impending doom that had hung over us for years began to lift, replaced by a feeling profound, serious purpose. We were not fighting the change anymore. We were surfing it. We were learning to ride the wave of a new epoch, one where humanity and the earth were not separate, but engaged in a constant, conscious dialogue. The water was no longer a stranger. It was a conversation partner, and for the first time in history, we were learning its language. I am an old man now. My days of diving into black water and wrestling with ancient gods are behind me. I spend my time on the porch of my cabin, watching the sawgrass wave in the wind, listening to birds, and drinking coffee that is never quite as good as the coffee I remember from the old ranger station. My knees ache when it rains, and my eyes aren't what they used to be. But my mind is more expansive than it has ever been. I am still part of the circle, though my role has changed. I am the archivist now. I collect the stories. I write down the history of the hidden bay, the details of the rituals, the names of the people who stood on the line when the darkness threatened to swallow us. I am preserving the memory of the memory, ensuring that the next generation doesn't have to start from scratch. Elena visits often. She brings news from the front lines. She tells me about the new sanctuaries being established around the world, protected zones where the aquifers are guarded not just by laws, but by communities of interpreters. She tells me about the young people coming up, kids who have never known a world without climate anxiety, who are finding purpose and power in the connection to the deep earth. They are natural at it, she says. They don't have the blocks and fears that my generation had. To them, talking to the planet is as natural as talking to a friend. Last week, she brought me a recording. It was a sound file captured by a hydrophone in the deep ocean, near one of the new migration sites in the North Atlantic. "Listen to this," she said, handing me the headphones. I put them on and closed my eyes. At first, there was only the static of the current. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thrumming. It sounded like a whale song, but deeper, slower, more complex. It rose and fell in a pattern that felt incredibly familiar. It was the hum of the entity I had met in 2003, but it was changed. It was richer, harmonized with other voices, other tones. It sounded like a choir singing in a cathedral made of ice and stone. "It's singing," I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. "They're all singing," Elena said, smiling. "The network is live. The entities are communicating with each other. They're stabilizing the ocean currents. They're helping to regulate the temperatures. It's not a fix-all. We still have so much work to do on the surface. But the earth is fighting for us, Dad. It's on our side." I took off the headphones and looked at her, my daughter, the little girl I used to take for pizza in Homestead, now a leader in a movement that was reshaping the human relationship with nature. I felt a wave of pride so strong, it almost knocked the wind out of me. "We did good," I said. "We didn't break it." "No," she said, taking my hand. "We didn't break it. We just helped it grow up." I look out at the Everglades now with different eyes. I don't see a wilderness to be conquered or a resource to be managed. I see a friend. I see a complex, living being that has its own thoughts, its own dreams, its own memory. I know that beneath the surface, in the cool dark of the limestone, there's a consciousness that remembers me. It remembers Oscar Cook. It remembers the fear, the sacrifice, and the love. And because it remembers me, I am never truly alone. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in the same brilliant purples and oranges that I saw on that first day in the hidden bay. The cycle continues. The tide goes out and the tide comes in, but we are no longer drifting. We have an anchor. We have a direction. To those of you listening to this story, wherever you are, I want you to do something for me. Next time you're near water, a river, a lake, the ocean, or even a glass from your tap, take a moment. Close your eyes. Listen, not with your ears, but with your mind. Feel the weight of it. Feel the memory in it. And say quietly to yourself, I am here. I remember. You might be surprised who answers back. The world is full of voices, waiting for someone to listen. The story isn't over. In fact, for all of us, it is just beginning. The water is open. The door is unlocked. Step through. Thank you for listening. This has been Oscar Cook. Stay safe. Keep watching the water. And never forget that you are part of something much, much larger than yourself. Good night.